Hey, everybody. So good to see everybody in the chat. Thanks for being with us tonight. Thanks for your patience as well. We're all trying to figure this out. This is my good friend, Terrance. Terrance, thanks for being with us tonight.
My pleasure, brother.
We got a lot of emotions in Atlanta tonight.
Yes,
Tensions are high. We've got a curfew at 9 o'clock that we got to make sure that we're done with here so that we can get home to honor Mayor Bottom's request that we are at home by 9 p.m. We'll certainly do that. But I wanted to just, before Terrance and I talk a little bit about what's happening in our city right now and what our response is going to be as a church, I just want to let you know we've had this date circled on the calendar for the last 6 months. Before the COVID crisis, before these protests and riots that have happened in our city. And the hope tonight was to launch this new language for our city, for our church, that of all the things that we could be known for, we want to be known for being for Atlanta. This season has allowed us a lot of space to ask some of the big questions. Who are we? What do we want to be known by? What do we want to be known for? And I feel like more than ever being for our city, being known as a church that's for our city is what we want to be known by. And certainly during the COVID crisis, that was true and is true. And even during the weekend that we've just experienced, it's just as true that because God's for us, because God is for you, we want to be for you. So I'll talk about that a little bit later on in our time, but we just couldn't get together tonight without talking about what has happened in our city. And honestly, I asked Terrance to be here. Terrance leads our middle school team, our middle school environment called Transit, but I could not be, it didn't feel right for me to just sit here and talk about this alone without the perspective of somebody like Terrance. Terrance is smart, he's articulate, he's thoughtful. He's challenged me as a friend in so many different ways. You've said some honest things to me that honestly in the moment hurt, but they've made me better. And I'm grateful for you. He's a dad, and he's been a part of Buckhead Church for a long time. So Terrance, tell us a little bit about you for people that have not met you, and then we'll jump into this conversation.
Sure thing, man. Where am I looking? I don't even know where I'm looking for that. All right, perfect. Just got to make sure, man. So I am originally from North Carolina, and the way that I came to Buckhead Church was kind of this wild ride, man. So a few years back, I ended up going to graduate school, seminary at Emory University.
You studied at UNC Chapel Hill before
Yes, sir.
that.
UNC Chapel Hill.
Big Tar Heel fan.
You know, I'm a huge Tar Heel fan, brother. It's kind of crazy because nobody is actually talking about the fact that we were trash in basketball this year. So that's kind of cool. So I ended up going to graduate school and seminary at Emory University, and I ended up doing an internship here at Buckhead Church with the living room. And got here, realized that what I thought ministry was, coming from my context before, I had no idea. And so this opened up a brand new world of possibilities for me. And so I fell in love immediately with Buckhead Church and with the opportunities that existed here in terms of my own calling, my personal calling. And so I stayed here as an intern, began to develop what I felt like God was calling me to do. I was very, very hungry and thirsty about what it was I was supposed to do, and asked to sit on every single meeting that I could. And eventually that landed me in the office of Billy Phoenix. And we began having conversations about what was happening next. And he told me about a position that was happening and coming available. And we began talking about it. And that all happened about almost 6 years ago. So I've been here ever since then.
You've been a voice, at least for our staff. You've been a voice of challenge, a voice of reason, a voice of thought. And is that something, how does it feel in this season, even in this weekend? How does it feel to be sitting in the seat that you're sitting in? Obviously, we have a lot of Black friends that go to our church. We have a few Black people that work at our church, but you've been one of the leading voices. How does it feel to have that weight on you?
I think, Clay, I feel like when you talk about the weight itself, I think there is, and I spoke about this earlier, there's a burden that comes sometimes. There's a beauty and a burden to being Black in America. But I think even more so in predominantly white spaces, there's a larger burden, because coming in these doors, I felt like if I didn't get it right, and if I wasn't a person speaking up and speaking out, then no one else would get the opportunity. And so I felt that very early on being here. And even more so this week, I spoke about how I was tired, and I'm still tired. I'm still frustrated, and I'm still there are so many different emotions that I'm carrying right now. But again, I feel like I must speak out. I need to speak out because it is my responsibility. And again, I don't speak for all Black people, but I do speak for, I feel like, a good number of them, particularly during this season with everything going on in our country.
Well, what I want to talk about with you over the next few minutes is, and Terrance and I have talked about this today, but I want to run through these 4 L's that I feel like, I heard Latasha Morrison talk about this through a curriculum she developed called Be the Bridge.
She's good people, man.
She has spoken at a couple different stages and environments in our church, and she's just a remarkable voice. But she put it in these 4 L's, and it was such a simple way to think about it for me. And it was something I never forgot. As soon as I heard it, I hung on to it. And the reason why I feel like it's helpful for tonight is because I want to give us a plan. I want to give white people a plan. And I want us to not feel like we're putting the burden on Black people to educate white people on how you feel and what you're dealing with and what you're going through. Yeah. And when I heard Latasha do this the first time, I thought, well, that isn't easy. Those are handles and those are actionable and practical things that I can do. And it's that was probably 2 or 3 years ago, and it has been transformative for me, certainly. So I want to talk about those. The first one, the first L, if you want to write these down, I think these would be worth thinking through. You can put these in the chat even. The first L is to, Latasha says to listen, but I want to talk about that second because the second one is to learn. And I want to put learn before listen for a couple different reasons that we'll talk about in just a second. But the first thing that that has been helpful for me is to learn, is to learn what it feels like, to learn the history, to learn the background of why there are riots. That quote that has been going around, I checked this with you earlier because I did not want to butcher the quote and I don't have it on our notes, but it is, Dr. King said that riots are the language of the unheard. What a remarkable statement, that we don't condone violence. Violence is never right. But to understand riots, it is helpful to know it is the language of the unheard, that there is a lot of emotion. It is clear that Black people do not feel like that white people understand them. And I think that's part of the reason why we've experienced that over the weekend. Yeah. So I want to give you some practical things that I feel like I've done to try to learn, but anything you want to add to that on what it means to learn?
I think you hit the nail on the head. I think anytime we put it on people of color or Black people, or even in talking about women or any marginalized group of people, to put the burden on those people or our people is not the way to do that. Because we carry enough. And in America, I feel like because we have such great freedoms and such great opportunities, we can do things as simple as Google search on the internet. And with that comes a list of books or podcasts or documentaries and things that you can actually tune into so that you can educate yourself on the country and the history of the country. And understanding that, like you said earlier, this isn't just happened yesterday. I was thinking about this and having a conversation with one of my friends. Racism is just as American as America is itself, in terms of the very fabric that America is. Like, it was built with that in mind, or built with that system. And so for us to think that we're going to get rid of it overnight, or this came all of a sudden overnight, is it's pretty telling to where we are in this country.
Well, we've had hundreds of years of slavery in our country. Yeah. And then in the mid-19th century, slavery was abolished by law. Yeah. And then there was 100 years of Jim Crow laws. Yeah. And then it's only in the last 50, 60 years that, because of the civil rights movement, that we have started to see some of the progress that we've started to see.
Right.
So we've got to remember that the history of our country, there is way more disadvantage than there is an equal playing field.
And even thinking about the simple things, Clay, and I think we had this conversation before, particularly about this subject matter, like thinking about the implications of history on today. For example, there's jokes and there's truth to the fact that Black people, this is a stereotype, but there is some truth to it, don't generally swim. And if you think about, if you kind of dig through that and where that is,
where did that come
you
from?
realize that Black people didn't have the same access to swimming pools that white people have had for forever. Mm-hmm. And the times whenever you had this even when there was access, there was segregated pools. Mm-hmm. And so if there was a Black person to be near a pool, white people would jump out. Mm-hmm. And so there was this access that didn't exist. And even that was, 100 plus years ago. And I think that was abolished somewhere about 50, 60 years ago. And there's still ramifications from that and implications from that today. And so it's like understanding the value of our history and knowing that nothing happens in just thin air. There's been this whole system and there's whole progress or whole process that exists with it.
I do feel like I want to point out the fact that I am sweating profusely right now.
Here, man.
Let me, for one, say we've got these incredibly bright lights on us right now, which is making it so hot in here. But number two, I will also say, yesterday I had the privilege and opportunity to go pray with the City of Atlanta Police Department at 3 p.m. for their roll call. And I'm standing in front of this room of SWAT team members. And I don't think I've stopped sweating since I was standing in front of them yesterday. I was so nervous and I was so humbled to stand there in front of those men and women, Black and white, that were about to go, that really showed, for the most part, there were a couple of exceptions, but for the most part have shown a lot of restraint to allow people to protest in the last several days, which I feel really grateful for. Shout out to our chief of police, Chief Shields, who got the opportunity to meet yesterday and tell her that we were behind her and we're for her. And that was a great opportunity as well. So that's part of the reason why I'm sweating. Let me stop you 1 second. And I want to talk about specifically why I think, and you can just jump in on if you think this is right or wrong. Here's why I think we need to put learn before listen. What I have experienced with my Black friends is I have felt in them fatigue over the last several years. Because they have been put in this position of having to or needing to educate white people on what they feel and what they're experiencing. And I finally, honestly, part of it was listening to Killer Mike speak in the press conference on Friday night, which the way he handled himself and what he said was remarkable. I thought, I can't let Killer Mike be that much more educated about this than I am. Because I've got a responsibility that I need to educate myself, and I don't need to lean just on you to help educate me, because there is so much we can do. Some things I've done, just reading a couple of years ago for the first time, the letter from the Birmingham jail by Dr. Martin Luther King is a great place to start. Because those words were written in 1963, but they ring as true today as they did then. So if you haven't read that, that's a simple, easy place to start. I was in a group 2 years ago, it was a group of about half Black people and half white people that were reading a book called America's Original Sin together by Jim Wallace, who is a white evangelical Christian. And it was great for me. It was a great first step for me to read a book written by a white person about what racism really is and what the history of our country really is. I'm currently reading White Fragility right now, which is a New York Times bestseller. Why are you laughing at me about White Fragility?
That's a good book, man, but it'll punch you in the face.
So it's been so uncomfortable to read it. It's bothered me. I wanted to argue with the author. I wanted to argue with the book, but it's been so good for me to read it because it's made me realize, there is a lot of fragility in me in talking about these topics and talking about these issues, which is probably another reason why I'm sweating. A couple of years ago, someone said, hey, you need to go watch the whole PBS documentary series on the Civil Rights Movement, which was 10 episodes long. Each of them are an hour. And I committed myself to doing that and watched the whole thing. And it was fantastic. It was so helpful. That gave me so much more understanding. And then a friend of mine that works at North Point said, hey, you need to go watch 13th, the documentary on, I think it's available on Netflix. And that was eye-opening. And I think part of the challenge that we feel right now is not everyone knows what we can do. And those are some things we can do.
Absolutely.
Anything you want to add to that?
In terms of the learning part? No, I think that's it, man. I think it is not putting the burden on people of color. And the same way that we can figure out what we want to watch on Netflix, thank God, because of Google and the internet, we can do the same thing with what we need to read and what we need to learn by a simple Google search. And I think it starts there so that you're prepared to move from that to being able to do the next thing that you're talking about in this lesson.
Listen is the second L. Listen. And this is what has been so helpful for for me with you. And first of all, Terrance, let me say, it is not easy to be in a situation where you're always the minority. The elementary school my kids went to most recently, to this move that we just made, it was a predominantly Indian school, 78% Indian. And it was the first time in my life that I had been in a situation where every PTA meeting, I was one of the only white people there. And it was so good for me to think about my kids being a minority in the school, because white people have always been the majority. By 2044, that will no longer be true in America. So thank you for having the courage to step into so many rooms where you are one of the only black people. But listening to someone is powerful. Why, from your standpoint, it's almost, it seems almost obvious, but why is listening so powerful?
Well, I think according to the theology of my grandmother, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. So and it makes a lot of sense, because when you're talking about this situation, what tends to happen, and I know in conversations where we've been talking about this subject and race and culture and all the things, what tends to happen is I will have the courage enough to say something about an issue or a challenge. And I believe that in itself is hard, because every single day, whenever, and again, I'm speaking for myself, but I'm probably speaking for some of the experiences of my people of color as well. When you walk into a space, and you walk into a space that is predominantly white, you almost automatically have to filter everything you think and say before you say it, because you know that you are being judged, and maybe not even just you, but the person that may get the opportunity or may not get the opportunity after you is also being judged. So for me to already muster up the courage to say whatever it is I'm going to say to you is already a big deal. And so for a person to, instead of listen to what I'm saying, what I'm telling you, to say things like, well, but what about this? Or what about black on black crime? Or what about, this other thing? Or what all lives matter? That type of stuff. Like, it's completely dismissive. Yeah. And it's fatiguing, man. Like it's like you're trying to constantly muster up the courage and the energy to have this conversation, and you're trying to challenge it in a very civil and proper way. But it's like whenever you're not heard and no one's listening to you, you get frustrated. And what happens is you eventually shut down or you go off, and you go off in a rage. So I think the value of listening is so critical, man. It's so critical, because I think it's key to helping us move further to where we're trying to go.
And I would say a step past listening is believing someone.
Absolutely.
It's saying, hey, if this is your feeling, if this is the way what your experience has been, if you feel like when you walk into a store that the manager automatically cuts their eyes at you and then follows you around the store, I've got to believe that that's your experience.
Clay, that is so right. So there's a story that I experienced some years ago where I was sharing about something that happened to me when I was 16. And when I was 16, I was pulled over for speeding in a car that couldn't go over 65 without shaking uncontrollably. And so I knew that the whatever I was being accused of wasn't necessarily true. And I was dragged out of the car, thrown to the ground, and had a gun to my head. And that happened to me when I was 16. So it's 20 years ago. And I remember sharing that in small group, because I you know how in small group everybody's sharing their stories and you kind of figuring out whether or not you even want to mess with these people. I don't know you like that. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of awkward. And so I muster up this courage, and I'm willing to share part of myself and part of my experience, an experience that I hadn't really shared with a lot of people because I was trying to be vulnerable. And I shared that experience, and there's a guy in my small group that says to me, right in front of everybody, that didn't happen. And in that moment, I'm like, buddy, we can step outside. But he completely tried to invalidate my lived experience. And I think that you said whenever someone is telling you something, you have to believe them. And I'm trying to think of the term, counterintuitive belief or counterintuitive trust. It's this idea that I am going to trust someone. I'm going to believe what they say, even if I don't fully understand it until I do. Yeah. And so as you continue to tell me stuff, even though it doesn't make any sense in terms of my own reality, I'm going to believe you, because there's no way that you would lie about something as critical as that. So I think you're right. Not only listen, but it's also valuable to believe as well.
Well, that's something every single one of us can do. And Andy teed that up for everybody this morning. If you miss church, make sure you go back and watch it, because what he said really eloquent about that all of us can go do that. We can find somebody to listen to.
Absolutely.
Third one is to lament.
Yeah.
To lament. To lament is to empathize with someone. Empathy is at the heart of God. Jesus is God's greatest exclamation of empathy. That God knew how humans felt, but he allowed his son to cram all of his divinity into a human body so that he could walk planet Earth, so that he could let us know he knows what it feels like to walk in our shoes. He already knew, but he's letting us know, hey, I'm telling you, I know what it feels like to walk in your shoes. And to lament with someone is to feel what they're feeling, is to feel their sorrow, is to feel their hurt, and to even sometimes go as so far as to say, I am so sorry.
Yeah.
One of the things I've learned from you in this season is it is appropriate during a season like this to reach out to your Black brothers and sisters and tell them, I am sorry. I'm sorry that this has got to be so hard for you. I can't imagine the kind of fear this puts inside of your body now. You're afraid for your kids. You're afraid for your son. You're afraid for your parents, for your friends, and I'm sorry. And I think sometimes we have a hard time saying that because we think, well, I didn't do anything. I'm not the one. I didn't put my knee on somebody's neck until they couldn't breathe. I didn't do that. Yeah. And so I'm not admitting guilt by telling you I'm sorry. I'm just lamenting with you. I'm saying I feel what you're feeling. Yeah. I did have someone who told me this week, though, that they said, hey, since all this has happened, I started just stopping Black people in public and telling them I'm sorry. What do you think about that, Terrance? Is that an okay thing to do?
That's probably not the move. That's probably just not the move, man. Like, if I'm walking down the street and I'm stopped 5 or 6 times by a white person telling me they're sorry, man, I think we got to do something else. Like, I appreciate your heart, and I appreciate, what your meaning behind it and the empathy that you're trying to convey. But I don't want to be stopped while I'm trying to go get some snacks 6 times because you feel sorry, But I understand. I appreciate the heart behind it.
Well, maybe limit it to people that you know, people that you're in relationship with. But we do need to lament. We need to get down into it. Because if we just rush past it, then we're missing it. And our heart should be broken by what breaks God's heart. And my heart should be broken by what breaks your heart.
Absolutely. And I think that's the thing about the power of empathy. And I think Brene Brown speaks about empathy quite a bit and being in the hole with people. Mm-hmm. And it's not necessarily understanding what they're going through or what they're feeling, but just knowing that their heart is broken right now. Mm-hmm. And I think right now, one of the ways that I think empathy works at its finest is to put yourself and put your family in the shoes of the people that are being affected. And I understand that can be difficult because to some, you've never had an experience with a police officer that has been terrible. Mm-hmm. So it's extremely difficult to imagine that. But just think about it for a second. Like, what if my son was the one laying on that ground with a knee on their neck, calling for their mom? You know what I'm saying? What if my son was the one being pulled out of a car and a gun put to their head as they're a teenager? Like, think about those types of situations and scenarios. And I think that, like you said, we all should be brokenhearted by that. Every single one of us. And I think if we are able to put at least our family members or our situations into those situations a little bit more, then maybe just a little bit of empathy will be able to kick in a little better.
I got an email today. This is one of the most encouraging emails that I've gotten recently. This is from a gentleman in our church who is a very successful, he's a retired attorney, has done some remarkable work for our country, has investigated some of the most, the stuff that he's investigated has been in the news. He's done a ton of work, very successful attorney for a firm in Atlanta, but also in DC. Sent me this email today, and he said, yesterday, he said, clearly white people he said, clearly blacks still feel that whites are insensitive, that they do not understand what black people are suffering in the community, that they're disproportionately impacted adversely in our culture, ranging from healthcare to health to jobs to pay to treatment in the workplace, fairness in civil and criminal justice systems and other less obvious ways. They have a right to feel what they feel. And they are right that whites do not understand them, what they want and what they have to bear in their lives. I've always thought that Buckhead is in a unique position to try to change that. In this predominantly white church in this affluent area that reaches a lot of African-American people. My belief is that for reconciliation to begin, whites have to move toward blacks and meet them where they are on their turf. And that whites, when they move toward blacks, it should not be that they're just doing something for them, but it should be to be with them and to hear them, to look them in the eye, trying to fully understand what they dream and what they suffer. That's where reconciliation begins?
Dude, I think one of the major points of that email is we are in the perfect position. Like, it's the same thing we talk about in transit. Every single conversation that we have, every single interest meeting we have, the whole point of it is to help people understand the opportunities that exist. So as I mentioned to you and so many others, like, we have students represented from over 250 middle schools in Atlanta, which is insane. So we cover the whole spectrum. I'm talking about race-wise, culture-wise, talking about economical status. We have people that can spend all summer in Spain, and then we have people here who may not know where their next meal is coming from. And they're all sitting in the same spaces in the same groups. And so that's why, when I sent you that message yesterday, it was like, hey, we can't just talk anymore. Like, we've done a lot of these, we do these things, and every time a disaster or something happens, we get together and we talk about it, and we have a forum or whatever, and then it goes kind of to the bottom of the priority list as things go back to normal. Well, I believe that this is a new day. We can no longer afford to just talk. Like, we've got to have a plan, and there has to be some action behind it, because there's no time like now. I think, as I mentioned to you earlier, man, like, this seems like the perfect storm of things happening to be a completely brand new start. Meaning that there's this COVID pandemic, there's unemployment is at an all-time high. People are looking for hope. There's this racial pandemic that has also happened, a racism pandemic is also happening. And I feel like it's time for the church, particularly Buckhead Church, because we are positioned in a very unique space where we can be the leaders of this. And I feel like if we're doing that, then other churches will get in line, and we will be able to show what the church is for.
Which leads to the last L, that we would learn, that we would listen, that we would lament, and then that we would leverage our influence. That we want to do that as a church, but we also want to do that individually. You released a video on your social media today about leveraging influence. Tell us a little bit more about what that looks like.
Yeah, so a couple of days ago, I felt the need to post because I wanted to have a say and wanted people to know where I stood. And part of the video, on the back end, I listed a few things that people could do as it relates to doing something and leveraging that. The first thing was to learn, and we've already talked about that. But in terms of leveraging your privilege, I was speaking specifically to my white brothers and sisters, like, take the opportunity to set up meetings with sheriffs in your county or in your neighborhood, as well as police chiefs, and ask them questions. Like, go with your friends, don't go alone, go grab a group of you and go and ask for an appointment to have the conversation with them and ask them questions about the training that they're doing. What type of training are you doing? Are you thinking about training from a diversity perspective, a bias perspective? Are you thinking about training as it relates to de-escalation, like how to use some of those tactics as opposed to riling things up? And I think what that does is it allows them to see that you're interested in those things, but it also holds them accountable as well. And the third thing was, and I shared this, it was to think about it as it comes to the landscape of politics. So a lot of the conversations that I had over the years being here, a lot of my friends have chosen to vote for a particular candidate, whether like locally or nationally, based on one or two different things. So it's like, oh, well, this person felt this way about abortion, or this person felt this way about tax breaks, or the healthcare situation. And it's that one thing that they choose to focus on that pertains to them as individuals. And I think that the challenge for us now is to think more outside of ourselves. We need to think about who is the best candidate collectively, if that's possible, for the good of everybody in that space. And so using the power of the vote to help transform communities based on the fact that you're no longer thinking about just yourself anymore. So I think that the learning thing is critical. I think the holding the law enforcement and different other organizations accountable to what they do and how they learn, and how they train. And then also just using your power and your vote in who we're putting in office.
Well, I feel very committed to using, I'm still trying to figure out how to do it best to use my voice, but every one of us has got to figure out how do we leverage what God has given us. We're going to take a moment right now and we're going to pray for our city. Terrance, what I'd love to do is I'd love to just give everybody a little space, maybe a minute of silence. And we want to give some space to allow God to speak to you. Let him direct how you need to learn and listen, how you can lament and how you can leverage. And some of the power in sitting and listening is feeling the emotion of what you're feeling. And part of this as well is we just want you to know what you're feeling right now. It's okay to feel it. It's okay to feel the anger. It's okay to feel the frustration. It's okay to feel at a loss. It's okay to feel misunderstood. It's okay to feel whatever it is you're feeling right now, because you've got a God who says, hey, I get it. I'm with you right there in the middle of it. And then I'd love for you to pray for us and pray for our city. And then we're going to conclude with talking about what it means to be for Atlanta. So just take a moment right where you are right now, as awkward as this might be. We're just going to give 1 minute of silence.
You know where we are. You know that our hearts are heavy. You know that we are tired. We are weary. We are frustrated. We are exhausted. We are confused. And God, I firmly believe in the scripture that says that your power is made perfect in our weakness. And I believe in times like this, God, I know personally I am so weak. I am so weak. But I know that your power is made perfect in all of this. And God, even the things that we don't understand, I pray that you would shine a light on those things in our heart. And honestly, God, I ask that you would give us a sense of restlessness about this whole thing. That you would give us insomnia about all of this. That we would be so moved to action that we would no longer sit idly on the sidelines. God, I pray that we would pray prayers of empowerment, prayers of peace, and not prayers of passivity. And so, God, I just ask right now for our city that you would heal the hearts and the minds of those in this space. God, that you would give us the resolve, the strength, the patience with each other as we try to move forward, Lord. I just thank you so much for what you've done on the cross and your son, Jesus, and the power of that moment and the power of the resurrection. And God, if you're able to do that, I believe that you're able to resurrect this church and where we are to a brand new day, so that from this moment on, we will be much different than before. It's in your name we pray. Amen.